Welcome to Electric Liberty Land, here on the Lions of Liberty podcast, your weekly shot of culture, comedy, and liberty with your host, Brian McWilliams.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Electric Liberty Land. I am the one and the only Brian McWilliams, here to welcome you to episode 244. Yes, a momentous episode we all were looking forward to. I know you had it marked on your calendars, 244. A number, if you add it together, 4 plus 2 is 10. And you guys, you're all perfect 10s. I'm kidding, you're not. But anyway, welcome to the show. I'm going to have an awesome guest, Benjamin Powell, on in just a minuto. But before I get into that, I wanted to make sure that I tell you to check out our Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And of course, you can find all our bonus content there, all of my daily rants, my good morning fuckhead rants. You can find the new Conspiracy Corner that just dropped. Also, Degenerate Gamblers is kicking up, guys, and we're going to have, I think, a new fantasy sponsor for that show as well that you'll hear about tomorrow on Odie's show, Finding Freedom. But I also want to tell you, before we get into anything too deeply, about an awesome news story I'm very excited about, which is iTrustCapital. Now, you may have heard of iTrustCapital before. Let me give you a little homepage action here for them. They are a fantastic IRA/crypto trading platform. So basically, you can get all the benefits, the tax benefits from an IRA while using crypto assets. Not only that, but also they have physical silver, gold that you can also put into your account. That is amazing. What's even more amazing is you can use promo code LIONS to get 1 month free. Now, you might be asking yourself, all right, is it safe? Is it secure? Yes, it is. They're backed up by Coinbase. They're also backed up by Curve. They're backed up by $320 million of insurance. So your funds are going to be safe in that account. You're not going to have them go anywhere. You're going to be able to take that out later on in life and feel secure and happy with what you're doing. They're also very trusted. 1,300 reviews on Trustpilot, guys, to tell you these guys are not scammers. They're not doing anything that is below the line. And also, they're very transparent in their fees. And speaking of, you're also going to be able to use iTrustCapital not only for your retirement, but also if you're doing long-term gains or short-term gains, you can use them for the lowest transaction fees on Bitcoin and any of the other 22 cryptocurrencies they currently have. And they're adding more every day. So check them out. Do yourself a favor and do us a favor. Use that promo code LIONS to get 1 month free. Your first month is free with them. And make sure that you get in on this now. Crypto is the future, and we want to make sure that you're not left behind. But of course, you're listening to this show. How could you be left behind, right? So anyway, yeah, check them out, guys. Excited to have them on board as a sponsor of the show. Almost as excited as I am to bring in my guest, Benjamin Powell, who, as you'll mention when I get into the interview, you know, we have our Patreon opportunity wherein if you join at $50, you basically get to produce a show. And Joy Morin had decided she wanted Benjamin Powell to come on here because she's a big fan of him and his work. Socialism Sucks. 2 Economists Drinking Their Way Through an Unfree World is his book that he's going to come on and talk to me about. But you can have the opportunity to pick a topic of your own. It can be something like having us watch a movie. A lot of people have done that in the past. We watched Logan's Run on here at request. I think Maurice Jones had asked us to watch Bigfoot movies. You know, you could ask us to review a book. You could ask us really anything you want. You get to produce the show. So thanks to Joy for suggesting this topic and my guest today. And I hope you guys enjoy it. So without further ado, a segue, please. All right, so I am here with Ben Powell, Benjamin Powell. He has actually been on the show before, back in the young days of Lions of Liberty, back in episode number 26, not with me. You probably forgot this. You probably just thought I went bald and I am still Mark Claire. But no, Benjamin Powell is back with us to talk about a book that I am fascinated by called Socialism Sucks. But before I get into that, let me give you an official introduction, Ben. He is, of course, the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He serves as a professor of economics at the Rawls College of Business and also a senior fellow with the Independent Institute and co-author of Socialism Sucks. 2 Economists Drink Their Way Through an Unfree World. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Cheers, Brian. Good to be with you.
and this is a drinking episode. We are doing a Libertarians in Living Rooms drinking liquor edition of this, as requested by a listener of ours, supporting listeners. If they give us enough money, because we're free market after all, they actually can request guests. And Joy Nicholas Morin had said, you know what? I love Ben Powell. I think he has a fantastic way of communicating, of finding different ways to discuss topics that aren't these standard talking points, and specifically said she loves your book. So what a perfect way to bring you back on, have a few drinks, and chat about the collapse of society.
Well, we'll have to try not to disappoint Joy, and then I'll have to extract a side payment out of you afterwards.
Oh, no problem. We can arrange that. So by the way, what are you drinking?
So I have a beer here, and I'm not going to pull a Ron White where I don't see it in my koozie necessarily. But I figured since I was going to be talking a lot, I needed something decently strong. So this is a Dogfish Head 120, 120-minute IPA.
Nice.
So that way there I can still get some alcohol in.
Yeah.
If need be, we got liquor behind too.
Oh, no, well, I mean, Don't get me wrong. If you need a shot, I came prepared. I've got my Hibiki. I actually finished up my Hibiki Suntory whiskey, which I love. Japanese whiskey, a blend that I find to be very smooth. And whatever Costco has it, I snag it. But I've also got some other bourbons with me. I don't have a nice bar behind me like you do. I wish I did. My man cave hasn't been built out yet, but you got a glorious setup there, Ben. And I appreciate it.
It works well for when I had to do online meetings over the last insane year and a half, because when they got boring, I could revert to cigars and liquor.
Beautiful. Well, actually, that raises the question: did Texas Tech go full Zoom everything? Did they do a hybrid? I mean, how's it been going over there for you? And also at Rawls College?
No, Texas Tech is one of the best places to be a university professor this last year and a half. I mean, other than that brief period in March, April 2020, when all universities were virtual, we were back in business in the fall semester 2020 like normal. Well, not quite like normal, but with it, I was teaching in person, and for the Free Market Institute, we were allowed to have public events, bringing in guest speakers from around the country. We just have to limit our audience and take some other precautionary measures that the university wanted. But as universities go, we were able to be closer to normal than almost anybody else out there.
That's fantastic. I would think for like business schools, and I always have to ask this because I was thinking, okay, in regards to the business school, probably you could still work in groups on different projects, get together outside of the classroom situation where you'd still work in person. But yeah, like I said, you just never know. So I guess that was unimpeded. You're able to do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, there were mitigation measures that the university took, but unlike, actually business schools in other universities around the country that were 100% virtual or didn't have any extracurricular programming, we weren't like that. So I was fortunate to be able to conduct Free Market Institute activities. We did a weekly research workshop with a visiting scholar from around the country all through the last academic year. And now this semester, we're back to almost fully normal, no masks, no quantitative limitations, no nothing. So looking forward.
The people aren't keeling over, dying in the streets. Is that what you're trying to convince me of, this reality that we've been told is a lie?
Well, I'm not talking about any of those numbers. I'm just talking about we could do our job here at Texas Tech.
Amen. Well, I don't want to get you in trouble, so we'll stay on target here. In regards to, you're talking about people coming in, visiting scholars, and you, a scholar yourself, along with the co-author of the book Socialism Sucks, is I'm sorry, I went on a card, I got lost. Robert Lawson. There we go. I was going to try to show the title of it real quick, but you and Robert Lawson traveled around the world, right? Two economists drinking their way through an unfree world, travels to many, many countries. And I wanted to particularly hear about this because, number one, I was curious what your take was on the ground there. And like I said, I actually downloaded the book on Audible. I find I can't read paper books anymore with the wife and kid at home. It's just impossible. I never finished them. So now I listen to them as I walk the dogs. But you traveled around the world. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts were as far as what you experienced, and then also what you think, and this is getting ahead of it, but just to give you something to think about for later in the conversation as we're both drinking, what you think a possible cure is for this disease of acceptability for socialism/communism that seems to have overtaken the younger generation.
Yeah, so to not get ahead of our conversation, I'll certainly say that was one of the motivations for working on the book. was we started this project in 2016, and that's, right on the heels of Bernie Sanders having a pretty popular presidential run. And for that matter, 2016, if you think for a Lions of Liberty type podcast, 2008, 2012, the Youth for Ron Paul movement, we get to 2016 and it's Youth for Bernie. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? I get it that they're both anti-establishment, at least in rhetoric in a certain sense, but the policy reality is so much different. So, and then of course, the polls showing millennials and other young people who had an attraction to socialism. That was one of the main reasons for doing the book. The other reason was Bob wanted to go get drunk in Cuba, and I wanted an excuse to write it off my taxes. And we said, you know what, this is going to be a text chapter because this book is different. We've written lots of boring scholarly articles, particularly Bob on the boring part, that few people read. And we said we want to try to do something different, reach a broader audience. But, writing academic journals, or even I write lots of newspaper columns that are for, normal audiences, but there's still an argumentative essay versus a firsthand travel blog, log of a book. The publisher was originally calling this book The Bastard Stepchild of Anthony Bourdain and Milton Friedman, which is exactly what we were going for. But all of a sudden we're writing dialogue and colors and smells and shit. And I don't have any expertise in doing that. So we tried it out with the Cuba chapter and showed it to some friends and friends who aren't academics, and with good feedback, then said, all right, I think we can build up this whole project and let's set up this tour from around the world. And that's what we did over the next few years. So we went, if I can do this in chapter order here, we go through Sweden, Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and we end back in the USSA by going to the largest socialist gathering in the United States to find out what the hell's going on with these people.
Where is the largest socialist gathering in the United States? My guess would be somewhere like Portland or Seattle, but I don't know for sure. I mean, it could be right here in California where I live.
Your instincts are good, but we just need to wrap in a little history. Chicago.
Okay.
Chicago over 4th of July weekend.
Okay. Now, is this going to the Chicago School of Economics, basically? Is that the...
No. Think of 19th century socialist movements in Chicago, Haymarket, and stuff like that. So,
you know what? I forgot. I was just talking with somebody, and I can't remember what the context was, who told me that for some reason Chicago was where everybody went. All of these economists were in Chicago during that time, and I don't know why. I mean, do you have any idea what drew them to Chicago of all places?
Yeah, what? So we're talking. So let's just separate for your viewers here. Two separate things, right? So there's the late 19th century socialist movement, labor movement that has a lot of people around Chicago, and of course meatpacking industry, transport, stuff like that. Then there's the more modern, early 20th to mid 20th century, what becomes identifiable as Chicago School of Economics. Complete polar opposite, right? Is a more free market economic school. Two different dynamics. And actually, I really don't know why the Socialist Conference is still there. I'm speculating that it's the old 19th century socialist origins of the place.
I guess I'll say maybe it's something like, a protest movement that was so large that it grew into this thing. I mean, who's to know? But anyway, sorry, I interrupt you. Please go through. I'm in particular. So you went to Cuba, you went to Sweden, you went to Venezuela. Where did you find? Well, number one, did you find the people there were very frank and open about their situation and how they felt about the realities of the systems they lived in? Or did you find there was a bit, to reference, Stockholm syndrome, was there a bit of socialism Stockholm syndrome? Did they view it through rose-colored glasses a lot of the times?
No, but let's qualify this a little bit. So Cuba is the one where we had by far the most interaction with normal, everyday people in the everyday economic transactions, conversations. And you have to be very conscientious in these places too, because people can get in trouble if they talk about politics and are critical of the regime. So we're relatively guarded in how we raise these things with people, and instead we let them bring it up. But I'll tell you, overwhelmingly with Cuban people, like, we did not experience any anti-America feelings from average Cubans. Now, there's billboards that, show Uncle Sam character with a big fist pounding him and shit like that of propaganda out there. But your average, I can't remember a single Cuban I interacted with on the island who had any sort of obvious anti-American feeling. And in fact, when we went there, that was 2016. That was in that window where Obama had just opened up a greater travel exception for more Americans to be there. We could have gone anyway for research as academics, because it's not the Cuban government that prevents you. It's the U.S. government makes it difficult. But, I'll tell you, the best thing I heard from someone there was a university student. We were walking through the University in Havana, and he stopped us. He said, "Where are you from?" And when we said the United States, "Oh, that's fantastic," he says. "It's great when people from the United States come, because you bring a little bit more." And we all know the next word in a poor country is going to be money,
of course,
tourism dollars, something like that. No, his next word was freedom. You bring a little bit more.
Oh, wow.
Freedom.
I'm surprised. I mean, I had heard that Cubans, it was almost like you can't, they told people don't attack Americans, don't steal from, because there was so much tourism dollars in there that everybody around Cuba said, don't mess with these people. They benefit all of us when they're here. So I'm interested. That's really interesting to hear that that wasn't the first thought.
No, it surprised both of us. And it is true that street crime for tourists in Cuba is minimal. It's very safe. The state monopolizes all the crime in Cuba. So that's one reaction. Venezuelans, of course, are fleeing their country en masse. And most who I talk to have no delusions about socialism. Instead, it's much more like talking to Cuban immigrants in South Florida who are anti-communists. When it comes to North Koreans, I got to be honest, we had very little interaction with them. Part of the rule with our wives when we were doing this book was that we weren't supposed to get imprisoned or killed while writing it, which jives with my overall.
Can't they respect your ability as artists, though, and scholars? I mean, come on.
So the way we did, and by the way, so like North Korea, they do allow Americans in, or at least they were. This has changed a little bit in recent years, but they were at the time allowing Americans in under special visas, and you go on the official government tour in the capital where everything's managed. There's plenty of amusing accounts you can read about this. We thought about doing that, but listen, I run the Free Market Institute. Bob Lawson, my co-author, runs the O'Neill Institute for Global Markets and Freedom. And he writes the Economic Freedom of the World annual report. It doesn't take much for the North Korean bureaucrats to understand that we're enemies of the state. So what we did there differently, we spent some time in South Korea. We did the DMZ, but then we went up to the northern border in China along the Yalu River with North Korea to the main trading city where most of their international trade, China's their main trade partner, goes through. And we went up and down the river there. We talked to people there. And people who are North Koreans in China, if they have particular Chinese ancestry, they can be there legally, but most of them are very afraid of being identified as North Koreans there illegally because the Chinese government returns them to North Korea.
Right. I would have to think there's a thriving black market then for falsified documents of Chinese heritage, right?
Well, there is essentially an underground railroad in China of missionaries who smuggle North Koreans out through China into Mongolia or to Vietnam or other places where they can then make their way to South Korea and freedom. But it's not the type of people that are going to be easy for someone who stands out like me in Dandong, China, to approach an interview. We talked to some people, but they were very limited in what they were willing to say there. So that ended up being more being on site to be able to write up the historical narrative of what happened with the two Koreas. Because, I mean, we all know, your viewers what you've all seen, your people have seen the satellite image, right, of North and South Korea at night, where one's lit up like a Christmas tree, the other one's dark. And, I've seen that for years, but what's striking, we got into Dandong, China at like, I don't know, 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, something like that. Got to my hotel and look out the window, and across the river, it's dark. There's a city of 300,000 people there. You don't see anything. You wake up the next morning, and it's not skyscrapers like Dandong, but it's mid-rise buildings of a 300,000 that was not there the night before to your eye. Striking to see that firsthand.
Well, it's got to be. I mean, that's where you hear stories of people that have made it across. A North Korean expats that have made it, that have found new homes. I mean, the two things that are surprising me is that there's not more stories, talking about what they've gone through, and so far as the dangers of communism becoming, dictatorial, which it seems it inevitably does, which is one of the lessons that seems to be ignored over time. But also, I've heard various stories about how they're treated in different cultures, like South Korea particularly, almost though they're treated And I understand it as kind of backwater because their society is, but I'm surprised there isn't a little bit more compassion from a lot of South Koreans insofar as how they're treating these people. And like, look, thank God you made it. Let us, help you, and let's not presume that this is a voluntary action that you live this way. This is the world in which you can now become a functioning member.
Yeah, highly recommend. So first of all, they should all buy Socialism Sucks. But after that, Yeonmi Park is a courageous young woman who escaped from North Korea, and she wrote a book, My Journey to Freedom. Has given many. Actually, she spoke at my Free Market Institute at Texas Tech last year. Highly recommend her book. You can also find her on our YouTube channel, and she talks about the personal experience of being smuggled accidentally in. Finding herself in the sex trade in China, but then making her way to South Korea and eventually to freedom in the United States. And she also more recently has messages for some woke Americans who think they're oppressed and what real oppression looks like. Highly recommend checking her out for an account talking about the things you're mentioning, Brian.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll see if I can grab her on the show. I think I've heard an interview with her before, actually, on Michael Malice's program at one point. So I think I'm familiar with who you're talking about. Well, let's move on. So what are some of the more these are the severe examples. Venezuela, of course, we saw become a severe example. And I'm not sure when you were there, the tragedy of Venezuela, a lot of times, is that the people holding all the power now, even water, electricity, basic food, are the military, it's the government in control of these things. So I can understand how dangerous it is for those people. So, okay.
Let's do a few things on Venezuela, because even your informed listeners and viewers do understand that it's worth making sure we're on the same page about some things, because this is a big warning country, a country that was a successful, relatively rich, democratic country, and what so-called democratic socialism ends up being. So go back 50 years, 1970, Venezuela is in the top 10 countries in the world in economic freedom. It's the richest country in Latin America. It has an income per person higher than Spain, its former colonial, colonizer. This is a successful country. Now, between then and 1998, when Chavez takes over and starts his Bolivarian socialism, they were on a long decline of cronyism and declines in economic freedom that led to stagnation and a lot of bad conditions in Venezuela where they didn't keep up with what they had. That's your situation in 1998. Chavez is democratically elected. International observers, including former President Jimmy Carter, say as elections go, these things were fair there. He democratically puts in a new constitution, declares Bolivarian socialism. And in the 2000s, our Hollywood people here in the United States are all saying, this is successful democratic socialism, because GDP was going up. Infant mortality was going down, education literacy was going up, poverty was going down. And what people didn't understand at the time was that two things were happening. One, Venezuela's economy was being hollowed out. So Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. And during the 2000s, of course, we have high oil prices. But if the Venezuelan government, by the way, socialism means something. It means government ownership or control over the major factors of production. Venezuela nationalized the oil industry and government-run oil industry. Over time, production starts going down. People aren't doing capital maintenance. They don't have the same incentives as private owners. And during the 2000s, with oil prices high and production still relatively high, sitting on these huge reserves, the economy is becoming a shell. Food production's going down. Food imports are soaring. The government's basically using its money, its foreign exchange from oil, to import everything that they need. Mm-hmm. Get to 2013, oil prices come down, and by that point, production in Venezuela is also going down. And all of a sudden, it reveals the shell that's there. Now, people will point to this and say, no, look, it was the oil prices that killed them. Listen, I'm talking to you from Lubbock, Texas. I'm an hour and a half from the Permian Basin. There was nobody starving in the Permian Basin when oil prices came down, because we actually had a functioning price system and capitalist economy behind it. Venezuela did not. And in fact, scholars who have worked on this and actually tried to look at Venezuela's performance even during the boom, what they find is when you compare it to counterfactuals of other countries producing oil and in the region, they underperformed. They didn't have as higher income as they should have. Poverty didn't go down as much as it should have. And this is all that hollowing out that was just being masked if you looked at the aggregate statistics. And then, of course, what happens, and this, you brought up the connection between political liberty and economic liberty, not quite in those words, but in your remarks a few moments ago.
My pre-ramble.
Nice. In Venezuela, it illustrates it's not so, some of your people probably love Austrian economics and stuff like that. And Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, was famous for talking about the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism. But there's a different, and it's not quite an impossibility, it's just an improbability of maintaining democratic freedoms while not having economic freedoms. This is something Hayek points out in The Road to Serfdom, something Milton Friedman pointed out years ago as well, that it's hard to have a large degree of political freedom without economic freedom. Socialism means some form of government control over the major factors of production. When you do that, necessarily the economic system is going to not provide the information or the incentives of a capitalist system that allow for increasing production. As a result, you get stagnation. But in political systems, when you get stagnation, high unemployment, high inflation, this is a recipe to vote the bums out of office. But when you have government ownership and control, you've centralized the economic power, and now you can punish dissent. So you've set up an economic system that's going to create dissent, but you've set up a system that can punish dissent. And invariably, socialist regimes throughout the 20th century and the 21st century choose to punish dissent when it starts to happen. So in Venezuela, you see them, Maduro got elected with over 2/3 of the vote last time. That does not pass the smell test when you have the world's second highest rate of inflation ever. And like the average Venezuelan in 2017 lost something like 24 pounds. They didn't find Jenny Craig. They couldn't feed themselves. So, and meanwhile, you have millions of people fleeing the country. What was happening? They're handing out food aid at voting stations, and if you vote correctly, you get the aid.
Isn't that nice of them? Yeah.
The employees at the state-run firms are ordered to vote for Maduro, or you lose your job. Democratic freedoms go away. So what was democratic socialism necessarily transitions to mere socialism. And Venezuela is the big warning one. Prior rich country, democratic, not a military coup that put it in place. Same result. Sorry, that was a long rant. I need to take a sip of my beer.
No, I think but it's things that people need to know. And I think that you look at, that is obviously the glaring warning sign, but you look at certain countries that have followed that path and kind of stopped themselves a little bit. Sweden is a good example, I think, if we can diverge into that. No, you're shaking your head. I'm off base here. Cause I was going to say in that, Sweden, I still have problems with Sweden, but they made a lot of money. They went down this path of full socialism and then said, oh my God, we're going down an even worse path here, and kind of reined it in, at least to my knowledge of it. So that now it's free economically, but they still have some socialist benefits. So tell me a little bit about that and your experience there on the ground.
All right. So our chapter in the book on Sweden is called Not Socialism, because Sweden's not socialist, nor was it ever. Now, you are correct about them reining it back from where they had gone, but they never went all the way socialist. So let's, Sweden, mid-19th century is dirt poor. They have laissez-faire reforms mid-19th century. They grow very rapidly. By the mid-20th century, they're the fourth richest country in the world. So this is capitalism success. And by the way, the guy who was like the leading policy proponent of it was a big anti-prohibitionist too. So he was a pro-drinker. Extra bonus. As
we both take a nice big swig.
Yeah. Then in the 1960s, 1970s, Sweden starts putting in a big welfare state. And it still has a big welfare state. High taxes, lots of transfers, big social safety net, all that. They also have a lot of labor market regulations, relatively high minimum wages and worker dismissal law type stuff. But if you look at the overall package of like capitalism versus socialism, government ownership of the means of production. Volvo is a privately owned company. You go to the hotels, the restaurants in Sweden, they're all privately owned. Everything, capitalism is the predominant way the Swedish economy is organized. So they have strong private property rights. They have good rule of law. They have sound money, very low inflation. They have very light regulation of business and credit markets. They have great freedom to trade internationally. On most of the metrics of like capitalism versus socialism, they're solid. They blow it on big government and welfare and taxes. And they blow it on labor market regs. But when you add all these things together, they end up being in the top 25, 30 freest economies in the world when you measure these. You can check out freetheworld.org for the Economic Freedom of the World annual report that weights all of these things together. My co-author, Bob Lawson, is the co-author of that index. So Sweden stacks up pretty well on that. It's not socialist. Now, what it did do is it got even worse on its welfare state taxes and regs, really slowed its growth, and then dialed it back a little bit. But it's still bad on those margins. And, you know, I think there's big problems with high taxes, a welfare state, and labor market regs, but I just don't confuse it with socialism. And the effect in Sweden, by the way, is they went from that being that fourth richest country in the world, their growth rate slowed. They didn't become impoverished. They just stopped growing. Now they're in the bottom half of OECD countries, you know, the club of roughly 30 rich countries. They're in the bottom half of those. It's because other people grew past them because they were more dynamic. So Sweden kind of got left behind. That's the consequences of big welfare state and taxes. By the way, it comes through in their beer. This isn't something that we've talked about so far, but the beer in the book, the two economists drink their way through the Unfree word. The beer is a metaphor for how these economies function. In Sweden, it's delicious. You can get it from around the world, but like a Belgian beer that I love, that's, you know, not very far from Sweden. It's cheaper in South Korea on the other side of the planet because the Swedes tax the hell out of everything. Whereas like Venezuela, the beer production stopped because they ran out of it like they run out of everything.
Right, just like bread and everything else. That's interesting. I was in Ireland, and Ireland, which has done some good things in the free market and with corporate taxes, but still has quite a bit of high taxes at home, and the same, I think, some labor issues as well. But I remember drinking Guinness in Ireland, and it was not cheap. It was, I mean, just as expensive as anything else. And I go, what the hell is happening? Shouldn't this be like Bud? You know, shouldn't this be the cheapest thing on tap? And it was exceptionally expensive, like $11 domestic, American U.S. transfer rate, like $11 a pint. It blew my mind. But I know you have a time cutoff here. We have about 20 more minutes to talk. And I want to diverge into lessons from the book as far as how we can reach the younger generation, you know, what you've seen there, what you took from the book, and how you can convey that to the younger generation coming up. As you referenced earlier in the episode, you know, 50% of millennials, or maybe it's Gen Z, I'm not sure exactly where it falls, but I think probably Gen Z, 50% of them are basically anti-capitalist, which is insane when they're living in the benefits of a free market society, but they've had this cognitive dissonance between the way they live and the economic system under which they have been sold this bill of goods. So what are your thoughts on that? Do we blame Sweden, and how do we counter it?
Yeah, so keep in mind, you know, part of this gets taken care of with aging. You know, the classic quote of, you know, if you're not a socialist at 20, you don't have a heart. If you're still a socialist at 30, you don't have a brain. The Gen Zers actually, I think, are better than the millennials on this, and they're younger and coming better. So what was interesting was going to the big socialist gathering, there was nobody my age there, almost nobody. It's people who were 35 and under and people who were 70 and older, ex hippies who haven't given up on it. The Gen Xers just weren't there. And within the younger people, then I wasn't there. I didn't argue with people. I wasn't there to give economic lessons. I was there to try to understand them. I'd ask them, what brings you here? What does socialism mean to you? Things like that. And I can tell you a few different groups that you kind of identify within that. So there's some that identify with socialism, but, you know, this is the classic, that's not real socialism. Yeah. I mean, democratic socialism or some version of socialism from below, which the two different mistakes there is the democratic one, as we already kind of covered with Venezuela, they don't get the necessary connection between economic liberties and political liberties, and that they're asking for an empty set. Yeah. The socialism from below is even a little bit more confused, but because they like, oh, I don't mean state socialism where the government plans your economy. I mean from below, where the workers and the people, you know, we plan it, we do it together. And I'm like, well, what, you know, like when the tire factory makes 35-inch tires and the rim factory makes 20-inch rims, how do you reconcile the differences of these workers?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm like, I know how in capitalism works. We use price signals that tell you what goddamn things to make to match up with one another, and then you adjust. In socialist systems, once you get rid of the competitive price system, if you don't want autarky, which really collapses living standards and dies, someone needs to coordinate it. And that someone is the Central Planning Bureau. So they're missing like the the whole process of economic coordination of once you get rid of prices, property rights, profit and loss as your way of doing it, you got to get something else because your hippie commune ain't going to make an iPhone. Like if you're going to coordinate millions of people, you got to.
Can I jump on that for a second? Because
Sure.
I was asked this question. I gave a talk at the Los Angeles Libertarian Convention recently, and I was talking about, one of these problems is trying to paint kind of left thinking as lazy, but then diverging. And a younger student asked me, not a student, well, he was a student, but not my student. But he asked me, how do you reach people? You talk about the problems with capitalism and how people view it. How do you change their minds? And like you're talking about with building an iPhone, there's that classic essay about how to build a pencil, right? Do you think it could be as simple as using the iPhone and saying, look, this is how these things work together? And it basically, could it dispel all their notions about how these economic systems would work by just proving to them how difficult it is to make that piece of technology that everybody is absolutely dependent on now?
For some of them, maybe. I hope so. But not for others.
You don't seem too enthusiastic about the idea.
No, I mean, listen, I'm an economic educator, so I spend all my time.
I know, you're on the ground.
And, I talk to my class about the division of labor and things like this, and the coordinationist perspective of an economy. For some sets of those socialist people, that will have some attraction. For some others, maybe not so much, or maybe it'll move some of them from the worker from below to the Swedish model. Because that's the other thing that I encounter at the conference is young people who are like, yeah, no, I mean socialism like Sweden. Because like Bernie Sanders and for that matter, Fox News. So whether you're left or right, they point to Sweden and call it socialist. And the lefties are doing it to say socialism's not that bad. And the right's doing it to say you should really hate taxes. But like that's not so socialism. But you know what? If it moves me from a socialism from a below to a hey, I want Sweden, that's an improvement in terms of worldview. And frankly, actually, my co-author has said this multiple times. If we're not talking to Americans, if we're talking to people all around the world, if the rest of the world looked more like Sweden, the rest of the world would become a much richer, wealthier, and more capitalist place.
This is kind of a funny way to take this, but should we argue that we need more immigration to fight back against socialism? Because it seems like most of the people coming from these other countries are probably not going to be huge fans of socialism, right? Should we open the borders? Will we become less socialist, not more?
So actually, Brian, you're pushing me in my direction of my latest book, which is called Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions.
Perfect. Let's talk about it. Hey, look, this is a libertarians and living rooms drinking liquor conversation. These things have no set boundaries.
So the other book, which I'm guessing there's about 5 people that read both Socialism Sucks and Wretched Refuse. It doesn't have any swears or drinking, and it has lots of regression tables and stuff. But I
can do an edit of that for you if you'd like. I can add in a lot of swears. That's pretty much my forte.
When Regnery edited Socialism Sucks, they edited out a lot of swears.
Oh, really?
That's a different story, I could tell you. But basically, we take seriously the question of whether immigrants would undermine our freedoms and other things that make Americans productive. And find that while it's a legitimate concern and one that people who are libertarian orientated for sure would influence what their view is on immigration, we don't find much evidence that immigrants decrease freedoms, and in fact often find evidence that they increase freedoms. And while this isn't proven by the numbers in the book, my own just drinking beer intuition is that there is a big selection bias. If you're picking up and leaving and going to another country in the world, you're not representative of the average beliefs in the country you're leaving.
Right.
And America is still kind of a thing. If you're choosing America, you're probably more predisposed to that. Then we can get into more detailed public opinion survey data and stuff. But overall, while I would say like Cuban immigrants are, an extreme tale of this of being the best anti-socialist voting bloc in the United States, there's an element of that same type of selection bias among other immigrants who come here.
Yeah, interesting. Well, anyway, sorry, I interrupted your broader context. Heading back onto socialism sucking and reaching the populations as you're working with them. So you were talking about different sects. There were a couple different ways you said people are interacting, especially at the socialist gathering you were at.
Yep. So there's the ones who don't understand political liberty and economic liberty. There's the socialism from below. There's then, and this is a lot of them that were there among the young people, they're identity politic people who have a particular issue they care about. They see something that's some sort of injustice or wrong in the United States, they're told about the aspirational goals of socialism, equality, fraternity, no ending oppression. And they say, well, then I'm a socialist. And it could be something about gender equality. It could be homosexual rights. It could be transgender. It could be Black Lives Matter. It could be immigration issues. It could be police violence. There's a whole host of them that you talk to about these people, and most of them had a kind of single one that was really important to them, and then some other. And they just identified with the rhetoric of socialism, of ending oppression and creating equality, and said, therefore, I'm socialist. And then you ask them, so do you mean government, like, government takes over Walmart? Oh, no, I don't think about socialism like that. No, so government owning the companies or planning the economy. Well, no, that's not social. Well, yeah, that is.
I just want more black people to have jobs or women to be paid the same. Although, sorry, go ahead.
So you know what, though, you're right in what you're characterizing and saying that. I think this group is actually the most important for libertarians to talk to. So among that group, they're not economic socialists. And honestly, when they go down the list of things that they thought were injustices in the United States, a lot of them I agree with. I just don't think the answer is greater state power, that often the problem is state power. And for them, I think libertarians who, watch the show, instead of dismissing them as naive young socialists, if you engage them and ask, what do you mean by socialism? And you hear that they like the goal, but then ask them, what's the problem? Just like, yeah, US militarism is a problem. Or yes, police brutality is a problem. And then talk about how voluntary solutions and markets can address it. And talk means ends. And some of them, I think, are the best people for libertarian types to be talking to that could convert socialists away from their view. Then there's the worst. There's also.
Sorry, go.
Go ahead. Well, here, but then there's the worst type, the ones that we can't. There are tankies in the crowd. There's people who actually mean state authority. And when they say, I don't mean the Soviet Union, they're full of shit. They actually do mean the Soviet Union, and that they would impose it on us in a heartbeat. And they vision themselves as being the ones in control. Those guns are worthless, but I'd say that they're a small minority of who I talked to at that conference, that the three other categories are the most of them.
Well, I was going to say, regarding the center category that you're talking about, that's, a lot of people have kind of stated a similar way of thinking, and it almost reminds me of the old improv. I doubt you know too much about improv, but the old saying in improv is yes and, right? Somebody goes with the concept and you say yes and, rather than saying you're wrong or pushing back, because then you just have immediate pushback from them. Yes and, okay, whatever you have a problem with, I agree with you, and here's how we can solve it. And let's add on to that and try to find a common ground to it. I also was thinking about this concept, which I may try to develop into a talk myself, but I want to get your opinion on it because I think it ties in. I was thinking about this lying in bed, not sleeping, which is that being right, which is something that I've in the past said, we're right about so many things as libertarians, as free market thinkers. We are demonstrably right from the lessons of history, in that certain things fail, certain things succeed, mostly free markets and capitalism. However, it seems to be that we're living in an age where being right simply does not matter anymore. So, do you think that we should abandon trying to remind people just how right we've been on things, and instead abandon lessons of history and focus more on inspirational messages of our way of thinking that tie into, like you're saying, similar goals? Do you think that's going to be a more effective strategy for us? And I know as a historian, you're like, well, I don't know, or an economist. But this is why it's a good question after we've been drinking.
Brian, I'm in favor of 1,000 flowers blooming here, because I don't think anybody has the correct theory of social change and how it's like one thing that I've worked on at some points in my career of things that have social dynamics that lead to greater liberty. I think, though, that, economists wearing blue blazers and white shirts, writing white papers in Washington, D.C. is not the way to do this. In the end, the average ideology, the hearts and minds of the people are what dictate the thrust of the overall direction, where the in-game politics and interest group screw us over on the margin. And if Americans were liberty lovers in the way that they were 200 years ago, it's a vastly different thing that we have today. And meanwhile, if Americans had the ideology of your average Frenchman today, it's something entirely else. And that some people respond to analytical arguments, some people respond to emotional arguments. I myself, as a scholar, am in favor of making arguments that I think are correct.
That's what I'm saying. They don't seem to be working anymore. That's my problem.
well, that's why I curse and drank in a book while still making arguments that I think are correct, but I made it more palatable for some people.
Well, amen. I'll drink to that. Cheers, Ben, to you. We're about it at our cusp of time here. So do you have any last thoughts that you want to impart to my audience? And then also I'd ask you to tell them where they can find you, where they can read you. Of course, I will link to your book, Socialism Sucks, as well as it's Refuse. Sorry, remind me the name again.
It's right off the Statue of Liberty, kind of. Wretched Refuse, the Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions.
Thank you. Wretched Refuse. Exactly. I will link to that and your Amazon link so people can download and find you. But where else should they go to if they want to read a column, if they want to find you on Twitter, if they want to follow and interact with you? Where should they go to find you? And then your final thoughts.
You won't find me on Twitter because that'd probably get me fired if I actually use it. I stay off that. But otherwise, you can BenjaminWPowell.com is my website. You can find plenty of stuff there. You can also find my columns on the Independent Institute website, or just Google me. You'll find a bazillion videos and people who hate me and people who like me. Final thoughts on this? I don't know. You covered the good stuff with the students and message of socialism. So here's what I'll do to end with, since this was your, what do you call it? The living room.
Libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor.
All right. So here's my 60-second or less alcohol as a metaphor for socialist economies related to this book spiel. So Sweden, not socialism. You have a wide variety of alcohol, but it costs a fortune because they tax the hell out of it. Venezuela, they actually ran out of beer production because the government monopolized. Well, it's actually a monopoly company, but the government controls foreign exchange and they couldn't import hops. Kind of need that for beer, and Venezuela doesn't grow them. Cuba, there's two types, Bucanero, Cristal. They both taste like a Budweiser you left out too long in the sun. So no variety under socialism. North Korea, that shit's god awful. As my co-author put it, you hope it kills you before the state does if you live there. Meanwhile, in China, Tsingtao and stuff like that's no good. But well, it's not bad. It's just like regular basic lager. But guess what? We found a Belgian beer bar in Dandong, China, because they have international trade. So that still makes its way through. Of the former Soviet countries, Georgia is beautiful. We never talked about Georgia. Great capitalist success story. No reform for 14 years with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now top 10 in economic freedom. Great wine growing region. They claim that wine started in Georgia. Even the commie central planners grew wine in Georgia because they knew it was better than like Siberia for wine growing. But they mass produced crap international grapes that weren't that good. And now it's all back to the hills and indigenous grapes. Georgian wine's wonderful. Exports are surging to the United States. Try that out.
Well, I got to try to find some Georgia wine. I'm really interested.
Yeah, the exports are way up in the United States for it. You can find it now, but none of the grapes, you won't recognize any of the grapes. So just try it. And the whites are like golden color because they press it with the skins and the stems. They age it in underground clay pots.
Oh, really interesting.
Great stuff. So there was the quick rundown. Oh, and the Socialist conference at in Chicago, the hotel, the Capitalist Hotel, knew their audience. They had on Revolution Brewery IPA on tap, which is a green handle with a big fist and a red star on it. And the young commies were drinking it up. But the irony, of course, is that it's Illinois' largest independently owned brewer, so independently owned capitalist brewer, and it produces a greater variety and quality of alcohol than all remaining socialist countries in the world.
I love it. I thought you were going to say that it was bought by Coors like everything else. It's like everything. Even my precious Yingling, although they partnered up. I'm a PA guy, so I'm finally going to get Yingling on this side of the world out in LA. But
we just got Yingling in Texas on Monday, and I was having one just before I opened this when I sat down.
What did you think? Did you try just the Yingling Lager, the straight up normal version?
Oh, I've had it for years in different places, but I had the Yingling Light because actually it's a unique spot in the beer market at 99 calories, but yet a colorful and flavorful beer.
It's pretty good.
That doesn't exist in that category otherwise.
Yeah. Well, God bless Yingling. And God bless you for coming on, Ben. Ben Powell, everybody. Welcome to Electric Liberty Land. Thanks for coming back to Lions of Liberty. And honestly, it sounds like there's much more for us to talk about. And we just ran out of time today. So I'll have to have you on another time. If you're game to drink and talk more, I'd love to have you back if you're up for it. And maybe we'll get into the liquor next time. I don't know, Ben. What are you feeling?
All right. Cheers for now, Brian. We'll see what we got next time.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben. All right, guys, that will do it for me in this episode of Electric Liberty Land. I want to remind you to always subscribe to the show. Listen to Mark Clear on Mondays with the flagship show. That's what Ben was on. If you want to hear him, I'll link to the first show, episode 26, I believe. It might have been 23. I'll have to look it up. It was way back, considering we're now on the hundreds and hundreds of episodes for the Lions of Liberty podcast. But Ben is a champion of liberty. Check him out on all those platforms. Like I said, I will link to his show notes at lionsofliberty.com/episodes/ELL244. I'll link to his books, his Twitter, his books, his website, etc. And otherwise, guys, listen to Mark on Mondays, John Odermatt on Thursdays, and of course, I'm here every Wednesday. Otherwise, from me, Brian McWilliams from the Lions of Liberty and from Electric Liberty Land, always stay plugged in to liberty.